All right. So you know what? I like to start with the hardest one there is. Let's start with the most difficult objection there is, and that'll be people say, "Look, I know when I was in seventh grade, I know the textbook had pictures of kids working. I know that was there, and I know that we had capitalism at that time. Therefore, capitalism causes kids to be working, and therefore we need government to stop the kids from working." Every single aspect of that understanding is wrong and destructive. So first of all, it's not like kids were all just skipping through meadows all the time, and then suddenly capitalism came along and we said, all right, kids, off to the mines. This has been part of human existence since the beginning of time for the simple reason that we are not born into wealth. We're born into poverty. The civilizations of the world were born into poverty, and they had to figure out how to create wealth. And when you have an extremely primitive economy where everything is made by hand or only with the most primitive machines, you need all the manpower and the labor hours you can possibly exert just to make life remotely livable so people can barely survive. It's not like we're saying, hey, you kids are just playing over there in the corner. That's a waste of time. Let's get you to work. It's that even the World Health Organization has looked into why do children work, and the answer is because they would starve otherwise. The family would starve otherwise. So it's not that we're cheering on kids working. It's that whenever the West tries to bully third world countries into abolishing child labor, the result is never now the kids are back to skipping in meadows. It's now the kids are prostitutes or they're dead. Those are the choices. And so that's why the leftist worldview is so utterly unhelpful, that what's standing between us and a perfect world is just institutional barriers. No, what's standing between us and a perfect world is reality, is the hard work involved in creating wealth. So in other words, where did child labor really wind up going? It went away not because we intervened in capitalism and get rid of it. By the time they tried to get rid of it, it was mostly gone already anyway. The reason we get rid of it is that the economy gets more productive. Instead of producing one widget an hour, you can produce 50,000 widgets an hour. So now you don't need as many people producing widgets. Now you can get widgets way, way, way cheaper because now you got a huge abundance of them. Competition pushes their prices down. So now your dollar extends farther. And so you don't need to send your kid off to the mine with a heavy heart just because you don't want him to die. You don't have to do that anymore because capitalism has created enough wealth for you to opt not to do that. That is the only way you're going to ever get rid of child labor. If you just simply pass a law against it, this would be like going to Bangladesh and saying, we're going to pass a law against any job that pays less than $100 an hour. You would kill everybody. I mean, I know it's desirable to have everybody earn more than $100 an hour, but just passing a law is the lowest form of human activity. Actually trying to ameliorate the conditions that lead to the problem in the first place is what capitalism has been all about.
This is a very interesting phenomenon because when you look at the Middle Ages, the infant mortality rate was staggering, like unbelievably high. I mean, basically, it seems like half of Europe got its crop fertility from decomposing baby bodies because kids just dropped like flies, they'd be buried. And when you see kids alive but working in factories, alive but working in mines, if you compare them to now, this is one of the great fallacies, is that everyone looks back at the past and says, well, compared to now, it was terrible. It's like, but that's not what you compare the past to. You compare the past to the past. You compare the past to where it came from. And where it came from was infant mortality. But the infant mortality was way out in the countryside where most of the writers, the intellectuals, the aristocrats, they didn't go. And so when the proletariat, so to speak, came to the cities and the kids were able to get jobs, they were able to earn enough to actually survive, which is why everyone, I mean, if the country was so great, why the hell did anyone ever come to the city at all? I mean, it would make no sense. Hey, feel like going to hell and bathing your face in lava? Well, no, actually not so much. So people came to the city because it was way better than the country. Now, it's so funny to me that the left, in a sense, would rather the children be dead than have jobs, because actually that's a fairly apt description of the left in many ways. I'd rather die than get a job if you're, on the left for a lot of these guys. And the last thing I wanted to mention as well is that the best way to eliminate child labor is to have a complex enough economy that you need a lot of human capital to be profitable. And that way, what you do, like on a farm, I mean, if you've ever worked on a farm or worked in manual labor, It's really brain dead. I mean, I don't know how people do it these days. I guess with headphones and all that, you can listen to stuff, but it's a lot of brain dead labor that I did when I was a kid and all that. And you can have a kid go out there and do brain dead labor. But if economic value requires sophistication, intelligence, human capital, then you make a lot more money by putting your kids in school than by putting them to work. So it's just a tipping point. The more complex the economy becomes, the more human capital becomes valuable, then the more it's a race to educate your kids rather than give them experience, pounding nails into wood. And it just frustrates me no end that people have this idiot reductionist view of saying, well, kids used to work, now they don't, therefore everything to do with the past was terrible. That's like saying, I'm a giant because I'm taller than I was when I was 5. It's like, no, that's not how you measure things.
I'm so glad you said all this, and in particular that point about the proper comparison. Yes, obviously, if we look back to the 18th or 19th centuries, people are living in conditions we would never choose for ourselves. But the point is, first of all, it's not a choice. These are the constraints imposed by scarcity and reality as an economy is growing and becoming productive. But also, again, we should compare what came before. So we look at people living through the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Well, historians now, by and large, have come to the conclusion that, yeah, things did get better for people. Their living space per capita increased, the amount of clothing per capita, their caloric intake, their life expectancy, all these things did go up. And they would have gone up even more if Britain hadn't been involved in war for a good portion of the end of the 18th century, the Napoleonic Wars and first the wars of the French Revolution. So the point is the real debate among historians now is simply how fast or how slowly the improvements came. But almost nobody says, I think E.P. Thompson, the Marxist historian, even says, well, look, nobody says everything got worse. So even they are saying that, all right, when we look at it dispassionately and we don't get carried away by photos that are indeed difficult to look at, we can make sounder judgments.
And it got better for more than just the elites. So in the past, you look at ancient Rome and ancient Greece, you've got significant portions of the population pure slaves with no rights, no economic freedoms, no free market. So you had this, creme de la creme aristocrats hanging around in togas, groping boys, eating grapes and discussing philosophy. But for the average person, life was a complete crap fest. But in the Industrial Revolution, and of course, everyone forgets the agricultural revolution that preceded the Industrial Revolution, which is in many ways more important, but it actually got better for the average person. If you look at sort of wealth along human history, it's a flat line for most of human history. And the only people we ever hear from are the 0.1 of 0.1 of 0.1% of people who were educated enough to write down and have their writings recorded and so on. The mass of human history just kind of came and went like krill under the ocean surface. Nobody even knows what's going on. But in the 19th century, Charles Dickens was able to write, though he came from a poor background, he was able to write and get published and become a world-famous author because of the Industrial Revolution, because of machinery, the printing press, new travel opportunities, the newspapers. There was a growth of the middle class, which had barely existed before. You got a tiny elite of really, really rich people, and you've got a massive void of serfs and slaves and day laborers and vagabonds and so on. You actually had the growth of an articulate and educated middle class for the first time in human history that actually sustained itself not through predation, not through imperialism, not through war, not through predation, and not through hanging off the backs of ground into dust menial labor slaves, but through productivity and freedom. How that bothers people is really beyond comprehension to me.
Yeah, it is. And Deirdre McCloskey is fond of noting this particular statistic, that if we look back 200 years ago, roughly, people were still living on about $3 a day. And you have to try to imagine spreading that out among your food, your clothing, your shelter, your entertainment, all these other things.
Well, public hangings and all.
Yeah, right, exactly. Now, that had stagnated. That had been that way for a long, long time. Then in just 200 years, just a 200-year period, we now have an 11-fold, and we're talking about around the whole world, an 11, even including the worst, poorest places in the world, an 11-fold increase to $33 a day. Now, in a pinch, you could live on $33 a day. A lot of graduate students live on less than that. You could do it. It wouldn't be luxurious.
I've been there.
Yeah, right. We've all been there, right? But if we look at the more advanced countries, it's gone to about $100 a day. And I know for a fact people can survive through that because a lot of people do. $36,500 a year is not a completely unheard of annual salary in U.S. dollars. So we should be cheering that. And you could try to say that This is because of welfare state programs. But the vast bulk of this is occurring before governments are even seriously involved. And the very fact that you could even generate enough wealth in a society to have that much left over, that it would be statistically significant to the point of an 11-fold increase even in the poorest countries in the world, says something about the wealth generating power of the market. So that's why, I mean, Ayn Rand used to say that if these people really cared about the poor, they would be the biggest advocates of capitalism in the world. And because they're not, I don't know what it is they're advocating. I don't know what it is, what their value is.
I think her formulation of hatred of the good for being the good is not far off, because the greatest reduction in human poverty has nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. The greatest reduction in human poverty has occurred over the past 20 or 25 years in India and in China, where literally hundreds of millions of people have gotten out of the poverty trap. And this is specifically as a result of the liberalization of the markets in China and in India. In India, of course, the great curse was socialism, because all the Indian intellectuals and the political classes were all indoctrinated into socialism at the elite universities in England. In many cases, they went back and instituted socialism, which caused massive grinding poverty to continue in India. And of course, there was communism under Mao and others in China. When they began to liberalize their economies, there has been hundreds of millions of people out of the poverty trap. There has never been a greater advance in the reduction of human misery and the increase in human wealth in the history of the planet. And of course, this is in stark contrast. This is sort of late 20th century, early 21st century, where the free markets were tried. This is in stark contrast to the attempts of the Marxists to attempt to alleviate poverty in Cambodia and North Korea and China and Russia and other places, where there was not only not an increase in wealth, but there was a massive destruction of human beings and capital and opportunities and wealth and human happiness and human freedoms and so on. These two contrasting poles, where the Marxists said, oh, we're going to solve poverty, and ended up creating totalitarianism that killed over 100 million people, versus the free market that said, well, we're going to eliminate poverty, and hundreds of millions of people in only a quarter of a century got out. If you really care about the poor, I think people should try and learn the lessons from that, but they seem to be studiously avoiding them.